Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming along to this event on funding the arts. I'm Richard Rushton, Senior Lecturer in Film Studies at Lancaster University. What exactly are we, or what am I expecting from today? Well, this event is part of a research project being run by the Lancaster Institute for the Contemporary Arts at Lancaster University. The project is being funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the project is funded under the sort of heading of the AHRC's Research Networking Scheme. So this project then is one that aims to form a network. And that's one reason why all these people are here today. In simple terms, we're networking. Now, I should begin by pointing to what the network is supposed to be about. I guess I should tell you who I am. I'm a film scholar. I'm an academic who writes books and articles. One of the things I write about is the notion of theatricality. And that, to put it very simply, is what this network is about. So the title of the project is Theatricality and Interrelations Between Art, Film and Theatre. Now, broadly speaking, then, we're trying to begin from a position that sees theatricality as a term to describe forms of art that might combine the various arts, say combinations of film and theatre or art and film and so on. Or it might describe those kinds of artistic activities that lie between the arts. So things like video work or art installations or online forms of art making, perhaps. So that's one aspect of the network. But the other aspect of the network is beyond the confines of academia. We wanted, alongside the academic investigation, we wanted to think about how the various arts are funded. And we were especially interested to work out whether it was possible to fund the kinds of activities that lie between the arts. So what this means is that we're interested to see if projects that utilise film and theatre, or art and theatre, and so on, forms of art making that combine the different disciplines. We're interested to see what scope there is in terms of funding for projects of those kinds. Today, then, we simply want to get a clear picture of the what, where, how and why of funding for the arts at the present time in the UK. In other words, we're not expecting speakers today to address the issue of theatricality at all. Rather, as I've said, we're just trying to discover what the current state of play for arts funding is in the UK. Further down the track, we might become more ambitious. Once we've established the network, then we hope to expand and intensify what it is that we're doing. Perhaps the first step in that direction will be the companion event to this one, which we'll be holding in London in July. That's at the ICA on the 13th of July. So that's it really. We're trying to establish a network in the hope that this will lead to bigger and better things in the future. Needless to say, more than anything, we would hope these activities will lead to an improvement in arts funding in the UK. As I said earlier, I'm an academic, so much of this is very new to me. I'm not an artist or a filmmaker or a theatre practitioner, so I'm really approaching much of this from a position of ignorance. My co-investigator on the project, Professor Andrew Quick, he's both an academic and a theatre practitioner, so this or what we're doing today is a bit more in his territory, and he'll be speaking later. I do have to thank him for having been so helpful in the preparation and lead up to this event. I must also thank the Dukes for letting us use this space today, and indeed we have Ivan speaking from the Dukes. He's participating in today's event. Everyone should know that the Dukes is central to the artistic life of Lancaster, and long may that be so. Okay, so that's the extent of my introduction. I'll hand you over to Charlie Gear.
Thanks, Richard. And just introduce myself. My name is Charlie Gear. I am Professor of Media Theory and History at Lancaster in the same department as Richard. But I'm also Chair of the Trustees of Grisdale Arts, which is a very interesting, important arts organisation in the Northwest, and a Trustee of the Lakeland Arts Trust. And Helen Watson's here from the LAT. And both of which are national portfolio organisations, and both of which bring up many interesting questions for me about funding, not just practically, but I think a bigger question that maybe one we might touch on is how funding concerns what the value of the arts are and how we enframe that if we're going to avoid merely instrumentalising them as being understood in value for money or some other kind of reductive understanding of what the arts are for. So I'm not going to say any more, but I'm just with great pleasure to introduce the first speaker, and we'll go in the order that they have been put in the publicity, to ask Alan Dix to come up and say Alan Dix, who I know for the great work he did with Grisdale Arts preparing our Paul Hamlin application, is, I think, you're chair of Hull Truck Theatre and many other things. So Alan is a man of great experience.
I feel like I'm about to get an honorary degree from you.
I congratulate you. So as Master of Ceremonies, all I can say is thank you, Alan, and let the Hunger Games begin.
Thank you. Oh, my word. That's a frightening thought. Hello. Can't see you, but I'm sure you're out there. My presentation is called Beam Me Up, Starship Creative Enterprise. In 1979, Tom Baker was Doctor Who, and the first series of Star Trek had finished some 10 years previously. The future Enterprise Captain Patrick Stewart had won an Olivier Award for Best Supporting Actor in Antony and Cleopatra with the RSC, and I set up Off-Cut Theatre, a short-lived theatre company that toured schools and colleges. Funding was relatively straightforward in those days. There wasn't much of it, and it mostly came from local authorities, the Arts Council of Great Britain, notice a different name, via independent regional arts associations, and then, of course, there was the Dole Office. There was no Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Instead, the Office of Arts and Libraries was administered from a cupboard in the Department for Education and Science. And before that, it had been part of the Ministry of Works, which had had responsibility for post-war recovery and reconstruction. In 1979, there was very little arts funding from sponsorships, trusts and charities, and the British Council supported work overseas by sending the best of our classical canon, theatre, opera, ballet, orchestras, fine art, etc., to places that would benefit from our white, Western, class-based approach to culture, mostly the USA and our former colonies. When I started working in theatre, Margaret Thatcher had not been elected, and the marketisation of the British economy had barely begun. Keynesian economics, centrist, benevolent, paternal and big state, had dominated the British economy since the late 1930s, and the monetarist ideas of Milton Friedman, with its belief in unfettered market forces, reducing national budgets and deregulation of the economy, were hardly known in the UK. We had, of course, been through the 60s, and this had resulted in a remarkable flowering of popular culture. It was based on consumerism, mainly pop music, fashion, film and TV, and consequently there was a tacit toleration of the revolutionary ideologies that came along with it. A lot of hippies got rich very quickly when they realised that pop culture was a commodity like any other, and today we have Richard Branson selling us wine and cable TV as a result. At the same time, there was an underground, alternative, more disobedient culture, and the Arts Council of Great Britain was often its funder. In the late 60s and 70s, small-scale touring theatre flourished, and the growth of art centres and alternative venues was phenomenal. Schools and colleges became more supportive of the arts, and many local authorities took their role as democratising cultural agencies far more seriously. Regional theatres became increasingly well-funded, and a capital programme saw many new buildings open. Coventry Belgrade, Derby Playhouse, and of course the Dukes in 1971. What wasn't so obvious was that this investment was small change compared with the funding that was continuing to be spent upon the classical canon and its almost exclusively white and upper middle class audiences. Since 1979, made significant because of Margaret Thatcher's election rather than my entry into the arts, we have witnessed some major shift in arts funding, or investment as we now call it. Ideology has, of course, had its hand in this process, and for some, putting money into the arts was and still is seen as paying for left-wing propaganda and something that should be discouraged as much as possible. The 1980s saw a savage attack on arts funding in the name of cutting public sector funding. They were tough times, and we learnt our craft the hard way. And, of course, we lived in cardboard boxes and had gravel for supper. The National Lottery came along in the 1990s and changed everything. I have heard, and I believe it, that the only reason the National Lottery came into existence was because the Royal Opera House needed a major refurbishment and there was no money to pay for it. But whatever the reason, a principle was established at the same time. Those who buy tickets should benefit from the good causes they fund. The Arts Lottery, as a consequence, has evolved into a stream of Arts Council funding that creates opportunity where previously there was little or none. The commitment to this principle ebbs and flows somewhat, and rebalancing our cultural capital, a paper produced by David Powell, Peter Stark and Christopher Gordon a few years ago, threw a mighty spanner into the works when it demonstrated how uneven and unequal the national distribution of funds had become. Practice had come close to contradicting the 2007 DCMS policy direction of reducing economic and social deprivation and ensuring that all areas of England have access to the money distributed. There has been a significant shift since then, with a redistribution of funding away from London and the South East, where it was mainly significantly concentrated. Since the 2010 general election, times have been tough for everyone dependent upon public sector funding. The Treasury grants of DCMS and the Arts Council has declined considerably, although not nearly as much as in some other sectors. And to counter this, we have been required to become more business-like in our management of arts and culture. We've been encouraged to develop relationships with industry and to build bridges with this commercial sector. We've had to analyse our income streams, segment our audiences, reduce our reliance on public sector funding, seek out philanthropists, try out crowdfunding, secure sponsorship deals, increase our sales, and so on. These days, the managers of arts organisations spend far more time looking at spreadsheets than thinking about the making of great art for everyone. I must admit to liking a well-structured spreadsheet. It's a small weakness and one that I indulge on a daily basis. The fact is that with funding comes responsibility, and I do believe that we should manage our affairs well and accountably, but not at the expense of our creativity. I heard a story many years ago of a theatre maker, let's call him Ken Campbell, because that actually was his name, who in the early 1970s was on holiday in Greece when he had an idea for a new production. He quickly scribbled it down on a postcard, together with an estimate of how much it would cost, and posted it off to the Arts Council of Great Britain. When he returned from his holiday, a cheque was waiting for him, and he immediately started work on his new show. And I don't care if that's an urban myth or not, and I really don't know how true it is. But these days, it could never, ever happen, and nor should it. But for me, it does recognise the value of the unconventional, and Ken Campbell was definitely unconventional. He founded the Science Fiction Theatre of Liverpool and was seen by many as the Captain Kirk of his own Starship creative enterprise. The arts are now much more mainstream, much more part of the warp and weft of our social and civic landscape. In 1979, it was considered quite radical to believe in the democratisation of the arts, to the point where a kid from a councillor's estate, as I was, could have access to the creative and cultural heritage of the nation. Today, such values are the norm, and we wield terms like access and inclusion, social cohesion, well-being and diversity like mighty swords when tackling the fundraising forests that surround us. We slash away at the beast of deprivation, inequality and lack of opportunity with finely turned phrases that would probably make little sense to a just managing family in South London or a pensioner in poverty in Scunthorpe. These enduring terms of equality are our totems, the thing that we hold dear when applying for funding from Arts Council England, trusts and charities or other parts of the public sector that could and should benefit from cultural engagement. Because, as we all know, the arts make you happier, fitter, healthier, more employable, better educated, more social, more eloquent, better looking, glamorous, fashionable, witty, sparkly, and totally adorable. For centuries, the arts relied upon aristocratic patronage to survive and thrive. Strangely, a form of this was reinvented by George Osborne, who, when he was Chancellor, gifted us theatre tax relief, which has injected a lot of money into new productions across a range of art forms. He also gifted Exchequer money for the Factory in Manchester, and just before his unexpected departure from government, did the same thing for the S1 art space in Sheffield. To me, it looks like whimsical funding, a kind of 21st century patronage, and Philip Hammond may not be such an enthusiast. What can be given in this manner can just as easily be taken away, and with limited due process, we can find theatre tax relief in an unexpected casualty in a budget coming your way soon, and that would hurt the arts economy a lot. We have a strange funding environment these days. Central government funding has declined, except when the Chancellor deems otherwise. Local authority support for the arts is in near collapse, by far the biggest crisis the arts have had to face for a long time. And trust and foundation investment has reduced because of low interest rates and the fragility of the stock market. Meanwhile, the ideologues of the right regularly and insistently beat the drum of business sponsorship and philanthropic giving, regardless of the in plain sight evidence that for most organisations it is a monumental waste of time and effort. But it must be done, it seems, as a form of genuflection to the principles of the market economy. The first question many people ask when presented with a creative idea in this world turned upside down, marketised environment we now inhabit is it fundable? They ask this before they ask, is it worth it, or does it have artistic merit? Or even, will this be an extraordinary creative experience? The artistic world I so naively entered into in 1979 was challenging. True, boys and girls from public schools in Oxbridge ran much of it, but it challenged me, and it took me out of my comfort zone and asked me to consider awkward questions about myself and my place in the world. It was political, it was demanding, and above all, it was exciting. My time in the arts has been an adventure that changed my life and continues to change me. And last year, Brexit challenged my assumptions about the communities I make work with and for. As chair of Hull Truck Theatre, I sat with the staff and the board, and we took a long, hard look at the realities that were unfolding as the city that voted 60% leave was about to become City of Culture 2017. Even then, who would have predicted that in a few months' time we would be facing the challenge of a general election as well? Times are challenging, and we must look for those voices, those ideas, and the works of the imagination that reflect and respond to what it means to be in the UK today. In 2017, as I sit at my computer, struggling with a ludicrous online funding portal that is Grantium, I search for the words and phrases that will chime with funders and investors of all sorts. I know that there is no God-given right to be funded to make art. None of us should assume a place of cultural privilege, but of course some people do. The barriers and hurdles to success are many. You need talent, determination, vision and confidence. You need to navigate the maze of funding opportunities offered by the internet. And then you have to know how to fill in an online application form that assumes you know the lexicon and language that will work with that particular funder. And still, in 2017, you need to come from the right kind of background, a background where you get nurtured, where you go to the right school and the right university, a background with access to a rich cultural life. This is, if anything, a receding prospect for so many people. The harsh economic realities of life are becoming harsher, more brutal and more divisive by the month. Despite the fact that there is so much more cultural and creative product on offer, I am not sure if I was living on a council estate in South East London today that I grew up in, I would be capable of making the same journey that I started in the 1970s. So, funding in the arts is not just about investment streams or fundraising courses or learning how to do Grantium. It's not about how to write a sponsorship pack or how to secure access to high net worth individuals. It's about who has access to the levers and who gets to sit in the control room of the Starship creative enterprise. If we want an ungendered Scotty to beam us up to great imaginative heights, then we better make sure he or she can acquire the tools, skills, confidence and capability to do it regardless of which planet they may have come from and what journey they have taken to get here. With luck, they might even be able to fill in the online Grantium application form. Thank you.
Okay, just to say thank you very much for a brilliant start.
Okay, so Lakeland Arts. Lakeland Arts is one of the most significant arts and heritage organisations in the north of England. We are known, we have a national and international reputation. We have a diverse portfolio of attractions, which on one hand is absolutely fantastic and makes every day different, but on the other hand can be quite challenging. We have Abbott Hall Art Gallery and the Museum of Lakeland Life, both in Kendal. Then we have Blackwell, the Arts and Crafts House in Bowness, and the soon-to-be-opened Windermere Jetty, Museum of Boats, Steam and Stories on the shores of Windermere. We attract about 70,000 visitors a year to our venues, and we employ about 50 members of staff, including seasonal staff, and we are a registered charity. Our mission. Our mission is to inspire all to explore and enjoy arts and heritage and the outstanding places we care for by visiting our museums and participating in a wide range of activities. What do we do? So we manage 4 award-winning visitor attractions in Cumbria. We care for and we conserve a broad range of collections, and this is where it gets really interesting, because we have fine art, decorative art, social history, maritime, industrial, photographic, costume, and also 2 Grade 1 listed buildings. We curate a nationally recognised exhibition programme featuring national and international artists. We deliver a learning and engagement programme working with a wide range of audiences, including schools, families, under 5s, local communities. We provide opportunities for artists to exhibit, sell and share with us and with visitors their work in practice. And we also promote health and well-being through our programmes, including working with people with dementia. So kind of brief history, Abbott Hall was designed as a very opulent house in 1759, and it's now recognised as one of Kendal's finest buildings. By the 1950s, it was almost derelict and threatened with demolition, and a group of local people formed a charity to save it. Once they'd saved it, they then kind of thought, what do we do with the building? And they decided that they'd open an art gallery. So we started off, quite interestingly, as a building, but without a collection. We now have got a nationally significant art gallery with outstanding collections. For the size of us, it's pretty impressive. We have over 6,000 works, which is actually more than the National Gallery. And we have a permanent collection that features artists such as Lowry, Turner, Ruskin, Romney, Lucian Freud, Hockney, Bridget Riley, Barbara Hepworth, and a contemporary collection as well, featuring artists like Sean Scully, Bridget Riley, and Paula Rago. Then we have the Museum of Lakeland Life, which is opposite Abbott Hall, housed in a former stable block. Here visitors can step back in time and explore the history of Lakeland, visit workshops and take a walk down a Victorian art scene. We have over 40,000 objects in this collection, with several hundred on display within the museum, and it's the only museum that does tell the story of the Lake District. Blackwell, the Arts and Crafts House, opened in 2001 following a 3.5 million fundraising campaign to purchase and restore this absolute fantastic masterpiece of arts and crafts design. Designed by Mackay Hugh Bailey Scott, it's one of his greatest houses and one of the very few that is open to the public. We, as well as having the kind of permanent collection of arts and crafts, we also do contemporary exhibitions, and we've worked with people like Laura Ford and Bernard Leach. And as Charlie just mentioned, we're also developing and delivering the Windermere Jetty, which is going to be a world-class museum and one of the largest HLF projects that's going on in the north of England. Here you will be able to see the fantastic collection we have of steamboats and historic vessels, and we'll also be telling the stories of the people who built, owned and worked on the boats. So what we're really known for is bringing great art to the northwest. We have one of the strongest exhibition programmes in the Northwest, and we've shown people like Barbara Hepworth. Last year we showed Rembrandt, Patrick Caulfield, Graham Sutherland, Francis Bacon. So it's really, I strongly believe, why should you have to travel to kind of major urban communities and kind of cities to see this art when I think you should be able to see it in a kind of rural locations. So it's really about bringing great art to the Northwest. The other thing that we're very proud of and works hand in hand with our kind of exhibition program is our learning and engagement program, which focuses on developing access to the collections, engaging local people and visitors to the Lake District. The program includes creative workshops, lectures, family activities, concerts, anything really that will just engage with people. Some of the greatest work that we've had and some of the greatest impact has been working with the health and well-being and, for example, as I've mentioned before, people living with dementia. So how do we fund all this fantastic work? So we've got kind of 6 main areas. The largest income is from admissions, retail and catering. So all our venues are paying, apart from children and students up to the age of 25 when it's absolutely free. But apart from that, you have to pay to get into all our venues. Then, secondly, it's Arts Council England funding. We are a national portfolio holder and 4 years ago became a major partner museum. If we didn't have Arts Council funding, we really wouldn't be able to kind of open our doors. Our Arts Council funding is crucial. Other funding grants and other grants and funding, things like sponsorship, foundations and trusts. So, for example, the Henry Moore Foundation is kind of one of our major sponsors. Support Trust, we have an endowment fund which has very strict regulations, but it does provide us with some limited interest, and that has been severely affected, obviously, in the last few years with the kind of the banking crisis. Our friends, patrons and benefactors, this is a group of people who pay to have special privileges, whether it be to come to previews or have insider behind-the-scenes events. We have a really strong group of friends, patrons and benefactors, and they pay by subscription. Our lowest source of income is local government, South Lakes District Council, Cumbria County Council, and they, as I'll show in a minute, have always remained the lowest source of programme funding. So just to give a snapshot, I've done 2007, 2012 and 2016. So in 2007, you can see that we were really heavily reliant on earned income. So kind of over 3/4 of our income came from our admissions, and then followed by the Arts Council, and then support trusts, which was the interest I mentioned, and then grants and funding and local government. 2012, we've got less earned income because our visitor figures were decreasing, and we had more money from the Arts Council for our programme. And I think by this stage, kind of 5 years ago, we were working really closely with the Arts Council and changing the direction a bit of Lakeland Arts as well. We were taking a lot more risks, we were working a lot more with contemporary artists, and we were more aligned with what the Arts Council was trying to achieve. So our funding went up, and the rest is kind of fairly similar. And then most recently, our 2016 income, as you can see, our earned income now is just over half, and with becoming a major partner museum, our Arts Council funding has increased, and the rest, quite interestingly, just kind of say the sort of same percentages. So one of the challenges for us is our visitor figures. Without visitors, we don't have money going in the till, and without money going in the till, that means we don't have money for our programme. So we started in 2007 with the figures there, and then there's kind of troughs and peaks. This really depends on our exhibition programme. I think we've lived in the last 10 years in the age of the huge exhibition. Forget your permanent collection, everyone just wants to see the latest exhibition. So we can have a Turner or a Lowry or a Paul Ray go on, but if it's not part of the exhibition programme, that's what people want. So we have a real challenge to promote our permanent collection alongside our blockbuster exhibition programmes. And as you can see, our kind of visitor figures go up and down. We do a lot of research into why this is. It can be down to general elections, it can be down to flooding, it can be down to having a bad winter. It really is kind of being in a rural location, we are kind of very affected by those kind of factors. So the minute our visitor figures go down, that's when we kind of start worrying about our income. So just to go into a couple of projects of how they were funded. So we've recently done a project working on Blackwell, and it was looking at interpretation. We were lucky enough to get 66,000 from the Heritage Lottery Fund, but the project was 100,000. So we did our own private, we did our own launch, and we got some private donations, public donations, and also legacies. If any of you visited Blackwell, you'll realise it is a very kind of spiritual, it's a very kind of beautiful, quite poetic place, and we do benefit from people leaving money to us, which is fantastic. Also, Lakeland Arts donation, we've obviously put some money into it, so we had to make up the remaining £100,000 to be able to do that project. And then coming to something like the Windermere Jetty, which has cost 16.7 million, we received £12 million from the Heritage Lottery, and then we've had to raise kind of the rest of it ourselves. We've worked really closely with South Lakeland District Council on this bid and the Regional Growth Fund, so a lot of our funding came from that. Trusts, corporate sector and individuals. We've had a big campaign around this project for years. This project has been going for about 10 years. So in that time, it's been our main kind of focus for funding. And then we still have a 200,000 funding gap. And one of the things that we've just launched is that you can have your name written on the jetty, on one of the planks on the jetty and things like that, to really make sure that we get the last kind of 200,000. So our funding challenges, the things that we face when we're trying to raise funding is stiff competition. We're finding that we're going for funding pots, and in the past there's perhaps been 20 or 30 people going for amounts, but we're now found that we're up against perhaps 100 people going for the same pot of money. And so there's really, really stiff competition around small pots as well as large pots of money. It's quite difficult to attract high-quality fundraisers. High-quality fundraisers can demand salaries, you know, £50,000-60,000, which is just not something within a charity and within our organisation that we can afford. So we do struggle to attract really high-quality fundraisers. Also, the chance and the opportunity to chase money, I think we don't want to kind of compromise who we are, we don't want to compromise our values, so, you know, we're really careful with who and what we apply for, so we don't, if at all possible, chase money. Our rural location means that we have few business sponsorship opportunities. I previously worked in Edinburgh and people were falling over to sponsor the art galleries there, whether it be from whiskey and gin at the previews to kind of having their name splashed across all the publicity. There's not many sponsorship opportunities for us in the Northwest and in Cumbria in particular, and the ones that they are, we've kind of really exhausted. It is very time-consuming putting together applications, spending your time, as we've discussed, going through these extremely annoying portals and getting all your information together. They are extremely time-consuming when you just want to be putting on and curating great art. Inflation costs, we constantly bring our shows up and down from London, and it used to be about £500, £1,000 to bring a laureate from London. It's now £4,000 or £5,000. So those inflation costs really do affect us. Also, being in a tourist area, which on one hand is brilliant and a really, really good opportunity, but we also can be subject to negative press. For example, when there was the flooding in 2015, we were really, really affected by that. Even though we had our doors open and we were ready and we could take visitors, all across the media, it was all about the negativity and how, you know, Cumbria was a no-go area, the Northwest was really difficult to get to, and that really, really affected us. Also things like foot and mouth, when we had the foot and mouth, we had to kind of close off Blackwell, and so these kind of things that you can't really plan for in many ways do really affect us. And obviously Brexit is going to have an impact on us, and depending on what happens in the election. So yeah, hopefully that gives you an overview of what we do, how we do it, who pays for it, and kind of the challenges. Okay.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I said I'm Ivan Wadeson. I'm Chief Executive here at the Dukes. As Alan pointed out, I'm one of those people who look at spreadsheets and think of finely crafted words. So I'm going to probably talk about the last 10 years of the Dukes. I've only been here 2.5, so tribute to all the people who've before me, who've put the work in, and some of it will be the story of our funding and our pragmatic response to it and how we've sort of played the game. And maybe for time some thoughts generally about arts funding. If this is your first visit to the Dukes, welcome. I want to assume you all know the building. But where we're sitting now, we're actually in 1796 Grade 2 listed Georgian Church, St Anne's Church, which became derelict in the 50s, and in 1971 it was reopened by a partnership by a touring theatre company and Lancaster City Council. Converted the church into this space, primarily, which from day one was showing theatre and cinema. So it was a rep company putting on a theatre show for 3 weeks and then a week of cinema. Over the years, the organisation has expanded and changed in different ways. 1987, we introduced Walkabout Theatre in Williamson Park, a Shakespeare and a family show. We still continue that with a family show. Last year was The Hobbit. This year coming up is Treasure Island. So the model is you move between 5-6 locations, and it's theatre that can be enjoyed by 3 generations of the same family. In terms of funding, the Dukes has traditionally had been Arts Council funding, Lancaster City Council and Lancashire County Council. Obviously, Lancashire is a 2-tier authority, and we had sources from both local authorities, similar amounts, and an Arts Council grant as well. In 2007 and 2008, way before my time in Lancaster, Arts Council, the story that we tell in these walls, some of you with longer histories might know more detail or a slightly different story, but certainly Arts Council didn't think that the way the Dukes was previously being run was giving them good value. They thought it was an old rep model that hadn't really changed with the times, that was quite insular, wasn't really engaging enough of the population in enough ways. So to provoke change, they cut the grant in half in 2007. The artistic director who came in on the back of that is Joe Sumption. He left earlier this year, but is directing Treasure Island, so he's actually in the building today. Then had to sort of come in with a plan about how to respond to losing half of the Arts Council grant. And it was, if the previous model had been 6 or 7 theatre shows a year, we went to 4 theatre shows and expanded our community engagement programme on our youth theatre programme. The other sort of reactions to that, so we also invested in our creative learning department. So over this period, despite that cut, the response actually increased attendances and it increased engagement from participants, particularly young people. So in about 2008, it's about 10,000 participations by young people. By 2014, that had doubled to just under 20,000. The cinema had always been an essential part of the programme. Again, in this period, what we did is increase the number of film screenings. Obviously, it's a low-cost base, low overhead. And obviously, also in this time, we had, pioneered by NT Live and others, live by satellite screenings, which have been hugely successful for us. In the first 4 years, we doubled the income and the number of screenings each year over 4 years. So that was quite significant for us. The other thing that we looked at was sponsorship and giving. So back in 2007, 2008, the Dukes only generated about £26,000 worth of sponsorship fundraising income, because it didn't need to at that point. By 2013-14, that was 142,000, so six-fold increase. So a lot of that was forced on the situation. The other elements of it was bar and catering income. We switched to a daytime bar and catering operation and really went for looking at income from that. So again, 2006, 2007, the revenue was about 86,000. By 2013-14, it was 150,000. So that was the immediate response back to the 2007-2008 funding cut. I joined in 2014, and part of my role was to look at the spreadsheets. Joe had been running the organisation as a single director. We'd grown to such a stage, we knew that there was going to be further funding cuts coming. So Joe made the case to the board that actually we needed to restructure the leadership team. So Joe became artistic director. I came in initially as executive director to look at how we run the business. So what we've done in the last couple of years is continue a lot of those changes in response to public funding cut. In second half of 2015, it was confirmed that Lancashire County Council would cut their funding completely by 2018. It had been talked about. We managed to negotiate at least 2 years tapered funding, so it doesn't go all in once. But that had been talked about. We were sort of planning for that potential, and it sort of became a reality. What our response then, not quite more of the same, but is we had to then also look about how we're replacing that public subsidy. At that point, if you think the Dukes in 2007, 2008, it was only about 34% earned income. It was 66% funded. By 2014, we'd reversed that. It was 66% earned income. Public funding was about 34%. Currently, we're on about 71% earned income. So we've incrementally pushed that up, but we're still going to have to go further. Should have said our film programme, we used to receive some regular funding through the old structures, sort of BFI when they were in place. There's no film subsidy investment at all. So in effect, we're running an art house cinema programme on a commercial basis. Can't underestimate the importance of live by satellite to us, being very significant. So I think there's three scenarios we're facing at the moment. Is we continue this incremental improvement. We look at more alternative forms of investment. We look at more fundraising. If we have a big hit from some of that core funding, I think we need to then rethink the organisation. We need to restructure in some way. We need to rethink what we are delivering. The model that we've tried to do over the last couple of years is keep as many of what the public engage with happening in terms of youth theatre events, the screenings and the live events. It would be very easy for me to come in and say, actually, we just shrink down to a cinema with a paying youth theatre. And we could run like that. But it doesn't bring all the other benefits, whether that's talent development, community engagement, the benefits that it gives to a place like Lancaster in terms of attracting visitors, attracting staff, people to stay in the area. So we're trying to keep all that going.
Hi, my name's John Randall, and so I'm a freelance film and theatre maker. So there's I work both independently and also in a freelance capacity for a number of different arts organisations, including having quite a relationship here at the Dukes, doing a few projects here in Lancaster. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of the kinds of projects that I've worked on and how a couple of those have been funded, and also what some of the issues are around funding a creative project as an independent freelancer as opposed to working with an established arts body or organisation. Within film as well, I've also done a number of fiction projects, and I suppose, in a sense, that's where the challenge lies in terms of funding, because if it's a project that you're personally trying to get off the ground that isn't attached to an arts organisation, it's initially, if you're just working on it yourself as a sole practitioner or with a small team or a small crew, it's the funding for film is seems to be in a separate field to the rest of the arts, and so finding those pots of money to fund short film projects, for example, was initially very daunting and intimidating for someone who hadn't had any experience of doing that before. So I'll expand on that a little bit in a minute. So at the moment, I'm working to produce, film and edit
a short documentary which is in collaboration with another filmmaker, Sarah Thomas, out in the northwest of Iceland, which is a documentary about a road which is essentially falling into the sea, that connects the last two villages before you reach the Arctic Circle. And we have kind of been gathering stories of local residents and other people who have had some kind of connection to that road, in order to create a film which tells the story of the journeys that have taken place along this road, which is now being reclaimed by the landscape. And as an independent project, I suppose, again, like I said before, I didn't really know where to start in terms of looking for some way to do that wasn't just entirely on our own steam and unpaid. I've worked on a couple of short film projects in the past which have looked for pots of money with organisations like Creative England. So they run the iShorts scheme, or they did run the iShorts scheme, I'm not sure if they still do, which allocated small pots of funding for short film. But in this case, actually, it was a slightly unusual situation because we were creating a film abroad, we wrote to the local road administration in the northwest of Iceland and said, "Oh, okay, look, so we're making this film about the road. Is there any chance that we might be able to apply for a little bit of funding just to cover the costs of filming and editing this piece?" And we thought that it might be in their interest, given that it could potentially be used as something which, told the story of a road which they'd been responsible for maintaining for many years. And so quite surprisingly, all it involved was an email to someone from the road administration, and they said, "Oh yeah, here you go. Here's a little bit of money towards it." And it wasn't a huge amount, but it was quite surprising to discover that there was no kind of protocol or bureaucracy involved in obtaining a little bit of money to fund a personal project in that way that was a little bit outside of the box. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Yes, Oliver Case. I've studied film at MA level. I did a degree, MA in film directing, and I have a sort of history of making fiction and documentary films. I was beginning to question these things, hence I started a PhD through computer science, which, it's an interdisciplinary program, but my journey from science to thinking about digital has been really rather fortunate in that I've been able to get very good funding to experiment and play with film. Yes, so money never entered my head, really, so I was a sort of typical sort of street artist kind of person, and then finding myself in the sort of academic world and applying for funding, I found that there's a lot of money there, especially in the digital sort of sphere where nobody really knows what's going on and what to do. I mean, it's my sort of, I love the digital in that it allows you to break all the rules. You can question everything that's kind of gone before because it's such a plastic, strange entity. So yes, this was the first. There was a competition, £10,000, which is more money than I'd ever seen to make art. To further the story of research impacts and engaging, interesting to a wider audience. So I wanted to kind of make a film, but also that would document itself. So using a computer, because obviously the automation with computers, we can try strange things like that. I'd seen this film Life in a Day, I don't know if you know, but it was the first sort of crowdsourced film where people sent their footage over YouTube, and then it was edited into this sort of pseudo day in 90 minutes of a film. And it was screened on the internet as well, which was kind of a first for Sundance. So yes, the idea of mobile phones becoming sort of as a, not accessory, but or a new means or new way of thinking about making films with mobile phones. And obviously local communities, this is the Gregson Centre up the road. I was thinking, well, if everyone's got these phones and we can all sort of, film stuff and, make media, well, how do we get it into the cinema so we can all watch it? So I came up with this idea of Life Mirror, which is an automated system for collecting mobile video and playing it in a film kind of reel. So just on the idea, I hadn't made anything yet, and I got another funding pot from, again, EPSRC, based on digital interventions in communities. Now, it was just interesting because the speculative, my approach and the way that I approached it was obviously it wasn't to make art, it was to make a system that made art. And that kind of was, very attractive to the funders.
I'm going to be very, very quick, as it were, because I think it's very important that we have discussion, and then we're going to run out of time. Just while we're setting it up, I was very taken by many of the talks, but especially the first one where the canter through the funding of the arts, beginning sort of around about 1979, which was the year that I left school, a school in Lancaster, actually. And this building was very, very important to me as a schoolboy for seeing both avant-garde and experimental film and also theatre. And then experiencing the 1980s as a theatre maker and watching funding being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. So in the end, I ran to the academy and found salvation there for 8 or 9 years. And then in the late 1990s, I suppose 1998, with a group of students that I was teaching and working with, I set up a theatre company called Imitating the Dog, and re-embarked on this journey to somehow survive again and find a space, a creative space in the touring circuit of the United Kingdom and wider, if it was successful. What's really interesting also with Alan's talk that started off the day off was this idea about really focusing on being creative rather than thinking about the funding. And I think that's what was unique about what we tried to do when we set off, as it were, was to really just focus on making the work. But we were in a very, very privileged position, and that was that a lot of the creative team were employed by the university, and also we found we could make the work within a university context. So what's the work? I'll just do a quick canter through. We made a number of shows very early on, which were very small scale, very experimental, toured to the dwindling touring circuit in the United Kingdom at the time. And then in the early 2000s, we were joined by another colleague of mine from years before who'd also fled to the academy, a person called Pete Brooks, who had worked in the 1970s and 80s in various theatre companies. And we started to collaborate together, and we made this piece called Hotel Methuselah, which was our most successful small-scale touring piece. From the very beginning, we were very interested in the relationship between theatre and cinema and very pictorial images. One of the things that we thought was, can we conceive of a kind of idea of storytelling without thinking about the cinema and the screen, because that seemed to be the dominant way that stories were told and communicated. And yet at the same time, there's something about theatricality both fed into and undermined this cinematic concept that we felt was so dominant in the culture. So in a way, we were seeing theatre as a radical intervention into the cinematic, and that was our exploration. And I suppose this continued really until 2014. We never really worried about the money. We did a show every 2 years. We applied for the grants for the arts, and we always got it. We never failed in our funding. I think in some ways the Arts Council didn't really care about us in one sense. We were doing all right. We were getting reasonable audiences. We weren't being that demanding. And we were a small organisation with not really a big infrastructure. And then basically by the 2011, 2012, the company started to grow. For whatever reason, our work began to be more known internationally. People started to make more demands on us. Would we come and work with them? Would we come and collaborate? And we found that our sort of amateurish organisation was starting to crumble because we didn't really have the infrastructure to cope. And this embarked on our strategy. And it was the first time we'd ever thought strategically about what we did. And doing the adaptation of Farewell to Arms, doing a mainstream text that we thought everybody knew that would be attached to the First World War in 2014 was our first strategic step as a company. And we'd been going 16 years by this point. And we did the Farewell to Arms, and 10,000 people came to see it. We made £100,000 on it. It was like suddenly we found ourselves in a situation where we could see how we could start funding ourselves as a company on a larger scale. And what we did from that point on was start to work out a funding strategy that might secure work for the people that were working with the company that weren't in the academy, and also mean that we could expand our productivity. Rather than doing a show every 2 years, start to do 1 or 2 shows a year. And basically that's been our strategy since 2014. It'd be very interesting it's a shame that Deborah's not here, because this year, for the first time since 1998, we've applied for non-grants for the arts funding, what's called the National Portfolio Organisation funding. That was a huge move for us. We don't know whether we got it. We await that result, which will come out in June, July. But having had to go through that process of application, you have to be strategic. And we've never really been a strategic company, thought strategically. Coming back to that first presentation that Alan kicked off the day with, was for us, it was always about really what we wanted to do as makers, as practitioners. And suddenly, in 2017, we've had to create all sorts of spreadsheets, strategic documents, mission statements, 5-year plans, etc., etc. We've had to learn a whole language of Arts Council speak and funding speak that we've never really been engaged with, which isn't to say we haven't had our own languages, which are the languages of the academy, the languages of the university. And it's been a very, very interesting process. So I suppose what I'm saying is very, very, very abruptly, very quickly, is that in some ways we're at a crossroads as a company, having been in existence for 20 years, really had, in an extraordinary way, things our own way. And just to give you an example, how privileged we've been. And also, it, to a certain extent, tells a story about how the university has changed as well, how the market has intervened in the way that universities are funded. From about late 90s to 2010, in the university, as an academic, I could apply for equipment independently from any restraints, really, beyond the wider pot of money that the university would be allocating, whether it be to science or the arts. So generally what happens in university funding is that each department or academic unit is top sliced and puts a load of money to the centre, and that's redistributed across the university. But as you can imagine, the sciences, in terms of capital funding, the sciences take a huge swathe of that money because they have to. They have big equipment, technological needs, massive laboratories, engineering units, etc., etc. Generally, we teach practically or seminar lecture. We make very little demands. We're cheap and cheerful as far as the university is concerned. But they used to feel a bit guilty about this, and used to come back to the arts and humanities and social sciences and say, what are your equipment needs? We will give you something. And generally, people would ask for a camera or some overhead projectors, or it was small beer. But when I got the knowledge of this possibility of a gift from the centre of the university, I started to say, well, let's have £200,000 worth of projectors. Let's have some large-scale servers that would allow projection to be used outside in venues, etc. And strangely, the university gave it over, 250,000. So Little Imitating the Dog got this equipment. We couldn't have done this work in the 2000s and developed our aesthetic without this university money. That's completely gone now, because the university caught up with what was happening outside in the so-called real world of market forces, and now that's impossible. Any equipment money is now attached to the departmental plan, and that departmental plan is based on the number of students you have and what income you create. So now I'm back to asking for a slide projector, because that's all that's possible for me. Which is one of the reasons, I suppose, we are now moving to thinking about how do we survive as a company, how do we continue experimenting, exploring through our various audiences, etc., etc. And that we're now going back to the Arts Council. But we can only go back to the Arts Council on the model which I think everyone's been communicating today. One is you get a certain amount of funding from the Arts Council, but you have to show an equal, if not greater amount of funding from other sources. And there's only a few places that you can find that money. But one of the places that you can find it for a company like ourselves is the income that you generate through your audiences. And the only way you can do that, I suppose, is to make work that's accessible, in some ways popular and exciting. I don't know whether Farewell to Arms is any of those things, not for me to say, but it did generate large audiences and it did generate large amount of income for us. That's the only game we know. It's the only model we have. So we're going to carry on exploring it. It will one day fail and will implode. But that's the situation that we have at the moment. Our strategy as a company is to do two things. One is to continue to experiment and be, if you like, at the cutting edge of a certain use of technology, projection, storytelling, which we think is about politics, it's about culture. It's about real things that mean things to people. And at the same time, make work that will go to large or middle-scale buildings, hopefully still be informed by those, if you like, ideals and principles, but will also be accessible to large audiences. And then we'll bring the funding into our organisation that allows us to continue to do that experimental work that feeds into that mainstream work. But without that experimental work, we don't really exist. My only feeling is I'm not absolutely sure it's the right strategy. I'm not absolutely comfortable with it. I mean, I wouldn't be saying this if Deborah was here, because it's a strategy that's in the documentation. But since she's not here, I can be really honest. But it's the only strategy we have. Just a little final point, which when Alan did his talk, reminds me of this terrible dilemma that we as artists or academics are in situating what we want to do with what's possible, was when the theatre company that I had founded in 1979 had its funding pulled by West Yorkshire Council and the Arts Council in the late 80s, getting my decade right. I went to work for an architect's firm in London called Building Design Partnership as a runner. And the job that I did as the runner was working on the Royal Opera House project that started off the lottery that you used of that thing. And that project, I remember thinking, this is a moment where the relationship between, if you like, nation and culture is really changing. And we're still living, if you like, in the shadow of that dilemma that was started off, I think, really with when Thatcher took power in the late 70s. And we've never really got over in one way or another. That's all I have to say.
Okay, of course the plan was for everyone to now come up on stage where we could have a discussion, but we're completely out of time already. So any discussion is going to have to continue in the bar. So I'd invite people to stay around and have a drink and have a snack, and to ask questions of the people who have presented here today. Apart from that, all I can do now is to thank everyone who has presented today. So let's all put our hands together and thank everyone very much.